Welcome back to part 2 of our series where we are talking about Microsoft Azure functions. So the previous video, we gave high-level overview. What are Azure functions? What are some things that you can do with it? And just generally speaking, how do we need to think about them when we start going into the coding process? So now that we have a high-level overview of Azure functions, we're going to jump into the next segment of our series, which is actually writing the code for an Azure function. The type of Azure function that we're going to be covering in this specific video is considered an HTTP trigger function. So we talked about this in the previous video. Functions come in many different types. Usually the types are defined by the triggers that trigger those functions. So if I have one that's set on a timer, that timer represents the type of trigger. This particular one, we're going to talk about HTTP triggers. So with that one, what the idea behind it is you can make an HTTP request. And then when you make that request, it triggers the function, which then does something, right? So it could do something literally as simple as send your name back. It could do something as complex as take your data, clean it all up, put it in a database, make another query and all bunch of other stuff, and then send something back to you. So very customizable, but the main idea behind it is that this particular type of function is triggered when you make an HTTP request. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is I'm going to show you how to set up kind of your workspace environment. This is the code that I wrote earlier just to test everything out, make sure I wasn't writing code that wasn't working. But this is basically what we're going to be replicating. There's going to be a couple different extensions you might want to get. This, especially when it comes to using Azure services, there's definitely some stuff that can be helpful. Okay, so first things first, let's create a new folder that's going to be housing our code. Okay, go to my little file explorer, go to my desktop. Oh, Lordy, I have so many repos now, it's ridiculous. Video, HTTP trigger. Just give it a name. I'm just gonna call this real. Oh, and I forgot. I did want to also let you know that if you are new to the channel, you should consider subscribing. We always have new content coming out. It's mainly for Python, VBA, and JavaScript and SQL, but who knows, maybe in time there will be some other stuff. So if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. And if you want notifications when the videos get released, make sure to click the little bell icon. And then ideally when I post it, you should see it. Okay, so we've created our new folder. Let's open up that folder inside of Microsoft Visual Studio Code. So I'm gonna go to File, down to Open Folder. I need to just select the one that I want to open. Now, inside of here, there's nothing. So literally when I open this, it's like, okay, so there's just no files, but that's okay. We didn't have anything in there. From here, I do want to share some extensions with you. So for those of you, again, who want to work with more Microsoft Azure services, there's a couple different extensions you might want to consider installing. If you go to your little extension panel right over here, the ones that I have, I'm going to have to filter it a little bit. There's one called Azure Functions. So this is the one that I use. You should install this if you're planning to use Azure Functions. The nice thing about this is you can actually create new functions from within Visual Studio Code. So normally you would have to do this through either the CLI or you'd have to do it through something other than Microsoft Visual Studio Code, even the Azure portal. But if you have this one, you'll get your own little extension over here where you can actually manage and delete, create, and even modify some of the services that you might have subscribed to or something like that. So you want to make sure that you install this one. So you'll have a little green button here that says install. Just make sure to do that one. There's some other stuff in here as well. There's Azure Account. I mean, you can do that as well. Azure App Service. I think they also have just a giant bundle called Azure Tools. So this one, if you install this particular extension, it's going to install these 10 different extensions for you. So if you plan to be using many different types of Azure services, this is probably going to be the one you want to use. And And Microsoft is also really good about, notifying you if they think there's a extension that you should be using as well. Okay, so assuming that you now have that extension installed, we need to create a new Azure function project. And so if you go right over here to your little Azure tab, you can see all your different stuff here. I don't need most of these, so I'm just gonna put it all down. Okay, so I have functions at the top. I always get this little notification. I've installed it multiple times. It just keeps popping up. I think it's a bug. So if you get this, just install it. And if it prompts you again, just disregard it. It doesn't really impact anything, but just be aware of that. And then normally when you use an Azure service like this, it's broken out into your subscription. So this is also based off of your account. So I'm currently logged into my personal Azure account. I do have multiple Azure accounts. So once you've logged into it, you'll see your different subscriptions here, right? So if you go here, you could see potentially 1, 2, or even more, depending on how many subscriptions you have. If you're not currently logged into Microsoft Azure inside of Visual Studio Code, you just need to open up the command prompts. Well, not the command prompt, maybe it is. Command panel, whatever it is, Shift-Control-P. If you see here, you can just type in Azure and then sign in. And then you just want to do an Azure sign in. You'll be redirected to a different URL. You just have to log in. Once you logged in, that's it. And then you should see your account down here. You might need to refresh your pane if you had already been logged into a different account. You can just click refresh, and then ideally you should see your subscriptions. Once you're here, if you open up your subscriptions, you can see the different functions that you already have going. So in this case, I have a function one for processing news articles, SEC filings, all sorts of different stuff. In this situation, we're going to create a new project. So this is one that we don't currently have open. So if you go up here, you'll see that little folder with the lightning. You're going to do create new project. And then from here, you need to select where this is going to be at. So in this situation, it's being a little bit smart, saying, hey, do you want to just put it into the folder you're already in? That works for me. Like I said before, Azure functions are very flexible, so you can write them in different languages. We're going to be doing Python. If you do Python, you do have to select your Python interpreter. Now, I will be telling you in a little bit about a very important issue that might cause you an issue. But for right now, just select a 64-bit version of Python. In this case, my 3.8.4 is a 64-bit version. It's very important it's 64-bit. I will be showing you later how you can manually adjust that if you don't see your option there. And then from here, you need to specify your template. So what type of Azure function are you creating? You can see that I've done different ones in the past. There's obviously the event ones, the service bus, queues, durable. I've never used those ones. Cosmos, blob storage, timer trigger. I've used that one. And then in our case, we're going to be doing an HTTP trigger. Okay, so at this point, now you need to give your function a name. This is what you're going to be seeing in Microsoft Azure portal and everything like that. So I'll just call this Sigma coding HTTP trigger function, whatever, something like that. And then the next part is authorization level. So this basically defines how strict it is in terms of accessing this particular function. If you do anonymous, basically anybody can access it. That's the idea behind it. So anonymous is anybody can access it. Function is a little bit more strict. So I think there's like a little code at the end of your URL that you need to provide. And then there's admin. Just for the time being, I'm going to do anonymous. I tend to do function just because that's a little bit more secure unless you want people to be able to access it. So just, again, keep that in mind. You're going to get stuff like this. Just say yes to that. It's just saying if you want to create a new virtual environment. If you do Control J, and then you go to your output, and then if you go to Azure Functions, you should see all of the stuff going through the process. So it's running through each of the stuff. And then basically what it did is it generated a bunch of different files for us in a few folders. So at this point, I'm going to go through some of these files. Some are more important than others. Some are just there. They're not really that useful to us. Let's start on down here. So requirements.txt. So this is where if you need to use different Python packages. So we're going to be using PyODBC, for example. So I need to put in this requirement file that, hey, in this virtual environment, you need to install PyODBC because the function is going to be using it. So in this case, I'm going to put PyODBC just so I don't have to do it again. And then other packages that you might need to use. So just be aware, some packages, you got to make sure they're kind of compatible with everything. We'll talk more about PyODBC and some things that we have to assume behind the scenes when it comes to things like drivers and stuff like that. Proxies, this one I just kind of leave in the back. I don't really care about that one. There's local settings. So is encrypted, false. This kind of comes in handy. So this will change a little bit depending on the trigger that you have. So in this case, if you're using ones that might interact with storage accounts, then this potentially could be changed. In this situation, it's just telling us that our function worker runtime is for Python. So you're not going to really be changing much in this one, I would say, but it's just kind of good to know that there's some settings that visually might look a little bit different depending on the type of function that you have. Okay, and then you have your host. So they have your extension that you're using. Application insights is enabled. Logging. So this is just more logging information. Version 2.0. Again, nothing really important here. Git ignore. We know what this is. This is just be posted on GitHub, which files to ignore. Function ignore. So this is kind of like a git ignore, but now it's specific to to the actual function. Because when we create a function and then we were to upload it to, say, Microsoft Azure, then what's going to happen is you're going to basically put on like a Linux server. And so some of these files, we don't need them. Other ones we do. This folder contains the actual function information itself. So we have a init.py. This actually contains all the code that will run when we call our function. We then have our function.json file. Notice that the script file points back to your init.py file. We'll talk a little bit more about this, what has to be in an init.py file in order for your functions to run. There's some binding information. So again, authorization level, right now we had set it to anonymous. The type of function, it's an HTTP trigger. For this direction of in, we're going to have a request. That request can either be a GET or a POST request. And then we have another one, which is HTTP, direction out, name, return. So some of it's more useful than other ones. This obviously is pretty important because it's telling you what type of request you can make with your function. So right now I'm limited. I can make a GET request or I can make a POST request. And then you can see what type of function it is and then the authorization level. So very useful. They do have a sample file in here as well. You can delete it. You don't technically need it. You have your VS Code settings. So this will pop up if you don't have any of these particular any of these extensions installed on Visual Studio Code. So Microsoft will pop that up for you. We'll show you how to locally debug your function when you start creating it. This kind of defines all that functionality. And then this is just more specific to your Azure functions. So telling you it's a Python. This is where the virtual environment it is. Python version 3, python.python path. So this is just saying, hey, when we run our Python executable, it's in our virtual environment. Debug internal console option. I don't know what that means, but it probably is just not going to open anything up. And then we have tasks. So these are going to happen every time we run through our function locally. So one thing is that it does need to install your your requirements.txt file. So this is basically saying, hey, every time we kind of boot up our function, if we want to test it, it needs to make sure that it installs all the requirements that we specified in our requirements.txt file. So again, this could obviously change depending on how complex everything gets, but in this simple example, this is basically what you would be seeing. And then you have your virtual environment. This is actually really important. So something that might happen for some of you is it will point to a 32-bit version of Python. You cannot use a 32-bit version of Python with functions right now. Maybe in the future it will be different. Right now you need 64-bit. So it's very, very important that this points to a 64-bit version of Python. So if I was to put this inside of my little thing, you will see it points to my 64-bit version. And then also note this is where my exe file is. It's very, very important. It's 64-bit. You will get an error otherwise. If I have time, I'll try to show you what that error looks like. Some other stuff, scripts, all this kind of stuff. Be a little bit careful when you start moving these folders, because if you go into some of this, you will see that it's actually pointing to your local directory. So if you start moving this folder and you don't rename things correctly, it's not going to work anymore. So I've done this before where I had put it into a I had put it into a different folder and I wasn't aware that I was changing up my environment. If you do that, you just have to be careful. Here it is. So this is very important. You notice how this is pointing to this folder path. If I was to take this video HTTP trigger reel folder and I put it, say, on my desktop and not in my OneDrive, none of this would work anymore. So you need to make sure if you're starting to move stuff that the file paths are correct. Otherwise, it won't work. And you'll be sitting there going, why is it not working? If you install any local packages, this is where they're going to be dumped to. Okay, so that's just high level, some of the folders, some of the things that might be important, might not be important, but it's there. I would encourage you, break it a few times. That way you'll learn a thing or two on it. You'll be like me and you'll go, oh goodness. Okay, let me check how long we've been going. Okay, I'm gonna go a few more minutes. I'm gonna cut off the video and then we'll cover it in the next one, just because I actually haven't written any of the code yet. Okay, so from here, we're now in the main init.py file. So there's actually a lot here. Functions are important. So you can have multiple files, okay? So you could have multiple files. They all better be under this folder. You cannot put it outside this folder, or when you start loading it into Microsoft Azure, guess what? It's not going to work because it doesn't know where to look for the files. They're not there anymore. So if you're going to be leveraging multiple files inside of your function, so maybe you have some scripts you want to run and it's just too much to put into one file, because that happens sometimes, you need to make sure everything goes under your function folder. So I can put one in here. I can say my func2.py. I can have a function in here and I can call it add x and y, right? I can have that. I just need to make sure that I put it inside of this folder. And I can use it inside of here too. Importing is going to be a little bit different. So you could do something like from my func2 import add, something like that. Not that. You could do something like that. And then you can say result, something like this, add equals add 1 and 2, something like that. So just keep that in mind. You just have to make sure that your files are structured correctly, and that if you do plan to import some of those functions inside of here, they need to be imported correctly. To kind of give you like a really advanced example of just a lot of different stuff, I've actually used some of these in different things. So I have some that parse filings and stuff like that. So it can, you can get kind of complicated, but you'll notice I have like multiple files here. These do all sorts of different things. And so I want to leverage that inside of my main one. Well, guess what? I have to make sure that I put it in that same folder and that I import it correctly. This was something that caused me a lot of headache in the beginning because I wasn't aware that it wasn't showing it in the normal way that I was used to it. And so you have to go through the log files and check that out. So this is just to save you some time and not go through that headache. Luckily, this one's not going to be that complicated, but maybe in our timer one, I'll show you how to do something a little bit more advanced. I don't want to necessarily overwhelm you. And then very, very, very important, you have to have a main function. You have to. If you don't have a main function, nothing's going to work. That's because the actual function framework requires that you have a main inside of here. So very important that you have a main function inside of your init.py file or whatever file you point to. So I don't have to call it init. I could technically call it something else, but I don't feel there's a reason to change it. But wherever you're pointing to, you have to have a main one in here. So be very careful about changing this. You shouldn't ever change it. Stuff down here you can change, but don't be changing this, because if you start changing this, you're going to break stuff. So just be very aware of that. It's an easy way of screwing something up, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, why is it not working? Okay, I'm going to cut it off. So I think at this point, hopefully we understand the folders, the files, what can break, what's easy to break, what's not so easy to break, all of that kind of stuff. In our next video, we're going to start writing the code. The goal is we're going to connect to a database. We're going to query that database. We're going to send the results of that query back to the user. We're going to show you what it looks like locally in your browser. And then we're going to also publish it to Microsoft Azure. We'll also discuss a little bit about drivers. Do not skip the part about the drivers. If you skip the part about the drivers, you're going to cause yourself a headache. There's only one driver you can use when it comes to PyODBC. So it's very, very important you do not skip that part. What else are we going to do? Just common bugs that might pop up, just little things like that. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.